Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Martin. I'm so honored to be here. I wish I was at LSU. I'm a country boy from Moss Point, Mississippi, from the coast. You know, and so being a Mississippi native, the fact that I'm talking at LSU is, you know, for some folks it's heresy, but I don't care. You know, but I was thinking about home just yesterday and this morning. I'm about to order some seafood. I'm going to make myself a pot of gumbo for Thanksgiving. So, you know, it's really wonderful to be here. I want to thank the athletic director, Scott Woodward, for his kind words and for his willingness to share my work with athletes across LSU's program. I want to thank Dr. Stephen Finley. I've known him for so long, and so it's wonderful to hear that he's doing such great work on LSU's campus. And I want to thank all the folks who made this possible, Dr. Martin, Sister Andrea, and everyone who's behind the scenes who, even though we're virtual, it still takes work to make this happen. So let me just jump into some brief remarks so that we can get into a conversation. Hopefully I won't go too long. You know, I'm kind of long-winded, as, you know, Morehouse men tend to be, but I'll try not to be. But, you know, we gather this morning against the backdrop of a nation on a knife's edge. Even after the election, and one must ask the question, are we really after this election? The divisions within the country, white, black, rural, urban, rich, poor, Republican, Democrat, are in full view. And it feels as if the institutions and norms of our democracy are collapsing right in front of us, right in front of our bloodshot eyes, in fact. We see an imperial presidency out of control, where folk were worried about the overextension of executive power. We see what has happened. We've witnessed the people's house stymied by hyperpartisanship, and the Senate, that vaunted deliberative body, appears by all measure broken. We've even witnessed the politicization of the military and the courts, all the while COVID-19 ravages the country. Americans are dying alone, and those who love them must grieve with the regret of not being able to say goodbye properly. You think about folk in New Orleans can't walk second line. Folk can't have the proper homegoing. And that regret will tinge their grief for the rest of their lives. Millions, you know, the economy is in tatters and millions are unemployed and hunger grips the nation. We've seen these long lines in Dallas, Texas of folk trying to make their way to food banks in the richest nation in the history of the world. But, you know, with all of that, the top percent still thrives. They're getting richer as death travels from door to door. You combine all of that with the shooting of Jacob Blake in Kenosha, Wisconsin, the police killing of Trayford Pillarin in Lafayette, Louisiana, the public murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis, the death of Breonna Taylor in Louisville, Kentucky, the death of Rashard Brooks in Atlanta, of Ahmaud Arbery, Walter Wallace in Philadelphia. I could go on. And people have been in the streets protesting what has been obvious to many of us for generations, that in this country, supposedly committed to the principles of democracy, the lives of Black people are less valued than others. We face, in effect, a moral reckoning, a fundamental challenge to what we mean by we the people. So, to my mind, the American idea, Dr. Martin, is in trouble. We have too long told ourselves a story that secures our virtue and protects us from our vices. But today we confront the ugliness, I believe, of who we actually are. And that ugliness isn't just about who occupied the White House or murderous police officers or loud racists screaming horrible things. It is in part the images of children in cages with mucus-smeared shirts and soiled pants glaring back at us. Parents separated from their children after risking everything to come here only because they believed in the idea. It is, and I want to remind you of this, Oscar Ramirez and his 23-month-old daughter face down, washed up on the banks of our borders. And all of this happened and is happening in the name of the American idea, and it is happening on our watch as many of us stand by silently and let it happen. Now, James Baldwin insisted, and you know I have to talk about Baldwin for a moment. Baldwin insisted that the country confront the lie that sustains its innocence. As he put it in The Fire Next Time, published in 1963, it is not permissible that the authors of devastation should also be innocent. It is the innocence that constitutes the crime. Baldwin relentlessly exposed the lies that America tells itself, right? In Nothing Personal, an essay he wrote in 1964, Baldwin put the point succinctly, quote, "We are afraid to reveal ourselves because we trust ourselves so little. And in this labyrinth, the person is desperately trying not to find out what he really thinks. Therefore, the truth cannot be told, even about one's attitudes. We live," Baldwin writes, "we live by lies. And not only, for example, about race, but about our very natures. The lie," Baldwin goes on to say, "has penetrated our most private moments and the most secret chambers of our heart." And as a Southerner, I would want to say that this describes the Southern landscape with such accuracy. This place that is so genteel, this place that is so mannerable, has underneath it this extraordinary cruelty and barbarity. The blood that soaks our soil makes us who we are. And we're constantly, in some ways, engaged in the repression of that very fact, an evasion of that very fact. And I say this as a child of the South. Baldwin understood the pernicious effects of the lie on America's character, that the lie involved what we tell ourselves, for example, about Black and white people, that white people ought to be valued more in this country than others, what I've called the value gap in democracy and Black. And we witness the monstrous consequences of what follows from this view in terms of our dispositions and our practices. So in Democracy in Black, I talk about the value gap, and then I talk about our racial habits. And the reason why I talk about racial habits is because I want us to turn our attention away from the so-called loud racists, the people who burn crosses and call us the N-word, and instead turn ourselves to the very practices that instantiate, right, the way in which this hierarchy, these racial meanings are reproduced over time. And if you are a reader of Aristotle, you know that habit talk is all about character formation. I used to tell my son all the time when he played basketball, we're going to put up these 600 shots. And he would get angry with me. And I said, no, we're going to put up these 600 shots today. And he said, well, why? Because in the fourth quarter of this game, when you get tired, your habits will kick in. And if you have bad habits, those bad habits will have that elbow out. And you won't be able to drop that shot when your legs won't lift. But that's an aside. Think of someone like Abraham Lincoln. If we were to take a look at Lincoln's October 16th, 1854 address in Peoria, Illinois, for example, and although Lincoln hated the spread of slavery and condemned it as a monstrous injustice, he nevertheless held noxious views about Black people's capacities, and certainly did not view us as equal to whites. Or think about Lincoln's speech about the Dred Scott decision in 1857 and his response to those who accused him of supporting interracial marriage. Quote, "There was a natural disgust in the minds of nearly all white people to the idea of an indiscriminate amalgamation of the white and Black races," end quote. Or the July 17th, 1858 speech in Springfield, Illinois, quote, "What I would most desire would be the separation of the white and Black races," end quote. For Lincoln, slavery was a moral and social political evil that deformed and distorted American democracy. But white racism was simply a natural consequence of the obvious superiority of white people for Lincoln. The contradictions of Abraham Lincoln take us to the heart of the central claim that animates my book, Democracy in Black, how race still informs or still enslaves the American soul. And it also informs my latest book, Begin Again. Indeed, like Lincoln, I believe the evil of slavery deformed American democracy. The late political theorist Judith Sklar at Harvard said that America actually didn't become a genuine form of democracy until the Voting Rights Act of 1965, right? But I want to insist that racism deforms and distorts the characters of those who embrace it, blocking the way for the development of the kinds of people democracy requires. In short, Lincoln could not even become the man, or let me say it differently. Lincoln couldn't be the man that his conception of democracy required, precisely because of his commitment to the value gap. On April 14th, 1876, for example, at the unveiling of the Freedmen's Monument in Lincoln Park, Washington, D.C., Frederick Douglass delivered his oration in memory of Abraham Lincoln. And I was struck by a particular passage. Listen at this. It must be admitted, Douglass says, it must be admitted. Truth compels me to admit, even here in the presence of the monument erected in his memory, Abraham Lincoln was not, in the fullest sense of the word, either our man or our model. In his interests, in his associations, in his habits of thought, and in his prejudices, he was a white man. He was preeminently the white man's president, entirely devoted to the welfare of white men. First and last, you and yours were the object of his deepest affection and his most earnest solicitude. You are the children of Abraham Lincoln. We are at best his stepchildren, children by adoption, children by forces of circumstances and necessity, end quote. And James Baldwin will pick up on this theme with his description of Black people as Abraham's rejected son. Douglass acknowledged the exalted place of Lincoln in the history of the nation, but makes explicit the limits of his character, that his commitment to the belief that white people mattered more than others distorted his moral vision and blocked the way to the attainment of the kinds of excellences his ideal of democracy required. This belief that white people matter more than others rests at the heart of this nation and confounds us at every turn. James Baldwin wrote in Black Power, an essay published in 1965, America, he says, sometimes resembles an exceedingly monotonous minstrel show. The same dances, the same music, the same jokes. One has done or been the show so long that one can do it in one's sleep, end quote. In 1876, Frederick Douglass explored the insidious work of the value gap. In 1965, James Baldwin was trying to give us a sense of the effect of the value gap. And here we are in 2020. And we continue to confront how it deforms our characters and distorts our democracy. America has to choose, y'all, whether it will finally become a multiracial democracy. And this involves grappling with the past that continues to haunt our present living. That George Floyd or Breonna Taylor or Jacob Blake or Walter Wallace were simply the latest victims of the slave codes that have shaped the way Black communities are policed in this country. That we have to tell the truth about the wealth gap, the achievement gap, the disparities in healthcare, tell the truth about so many things. And to my mind, if we answered the riddle of the South, we've answered the riddle of the Sphinx. That the key to the country's well-being rests right where you are. For as Baldwin wrote, quote, the trouble is deeper than we wish to think, because the trouble is in us. And we will never conquer that unbearable human isolation. We will never establish human communities, Baldwin says, until we stare our ghastly failures in the face. From the beginning, Americans have imagined a way of being together as a country that takes for granted a kind of selfishness that masquerades as liberty and freedom. Selfishness. People don't even want to put on a damn mask. Selfishness. People just want to do their thing in the midst of a pandemic that is killing us at alarming rates. We have been willing to allow the belief in widespread prosperity to compromise our commitments to democracy. As long as I get mine, I can give a damn about democracy, some say. And we have allowed white supremacy to wrap itself around the basic tenets of our way of life. Each has grown and flourished as we've sought comfort in material possessions and illusions that allow us to take flight from the empty aspects of our lives. The social enemy of modernity takes on a particular resonance in this place called America. Even in those moments of crises that call for national sacrifice and sometimes a reimagining of who we are as a nation, we have responded with courage, and we have responded with courage and commitment. But today we also cleave to these old ideas that warp how we live together. It was only a matter of time, and time can be a fickle thing, that we would end up right where we are now. in a place where it seems that too many have given up their stake in American life for their own selfish ends. So beyond the hard politics and the public health crisis surrounding coronavirus, we all have to grapple with the reality of death and loneliness and selfishness, which have also shaped how we experience the last few years, how we've experienced the last few years. You know, by the time Joe Biden takes the oath of office, some project that over 400,000 Americans will be dead. And again, many would have died alone. Loved ones would have had to say goodbye by a smartphone and figure out how to grieve without collective rituals of mourning and loss. You know, the former president of Harvard, I'm coming to a close. You know, that means I got about another page and a half. Those of you, yeah, I'm just kidding, right? In The Republic of Suffering, Drew Faust, the former president of Harvard, wrote about the Civil War. And she wrote that, quote, death created the modern American Union, not just by ensuring national survival, but by shaping enduring national structures and commitments, end quote. For her, the Civil War and all of its carnage, death, inspired self-scrutiny and self-definition. You can think of all the thousands of Civil War photographs of the dead and what those images forced the nation to remember. This is anathema to our time. We have more images and videos of police killing Black people than we do of the carnage of COVID-19. Today, the dead from coronavirus is principally a private affair where a sense of shared suffering is fleeting at best. With this virus, death has shown us our disunion. You know, at the end of the day, we've all been birthed in the American fantasy of itself as an example of democracy achieved. That fantasy has in some ways distorted and disfigured our moral sense because it requires that we lie to ourselves about what we've done. And a lie that thrives on a kind of willful ignorance makes this place and makes us monstrous. I believe it is our task today to do exactly what Jimmy Baldwin called for in 1962. Mount an unending attack, he said, on all that Americans believe themselves to hold sacred. It is to unmask the panic at the root. Our recent presidential election came then at a time of moral reckoning, y'all. But I pray that we do not trade one fantasy for another, that Trump's defeat will somehow affirm America's inherent goodness and put a grateful republic back to sleep. Presidential elections alone, no matter how momentous, do not settle the question of who we take ourselves to be. The answer to that question will emerge in what we do after this election. So we must now risk everything in this moment. And that includes those of you in sports, this extraordinary program of LSU, and all of the influence you exert. It's not just enough to play on the field. You are Americans too. You bear the burden of this history as well. And you know, like I know, that our country is broken. In so many ways, our politics now resembles the mania of fans in the stands. People latch on to teams and they live or die by them. You know this LSU type, right? So you have to leverage that loyalty and push for a more just America. Those of you who are athletes who have an extraordinary future ahead of you, the question you have to ask yourself is, what kind of human being will I be? Will I be committed to my own well-being and the well-being of my family? Or will I have a broader sense of the public good? Will I succumb to a kind of selfishness and greed that has eroded the very foundation of our democracy? Or will I be other regarding? Will I have a robust sense of what a just country looks like? And will I act on behalf of it? Will I leverage my celebrity on behalf of it? Will I risk everything on behalf of it? Or will you be part of the problem? Will you be a member of the latest in the long line of those who care nothing about their fellows and only care about themselves? All of us no matter where we're located, must risk everything now because the country is broken. We have to figure out a different way of being together to finally leave behind the value gap, this belief that white people matter more than others. Leave it behind and leave behind the lies that protect our innocence. And we must finally grow the hell up. Leave behind this longing to be forever young and forever innocent and step into the game and risk everything for a new America. Every single time a new America is about to be born, however, the umbilical cord of white supremacy has been wrapped around its neck, choked the life out of it. You and I have to be better midwives, y'all. We have to do this work that this moment requires. In an essay that Baldwin wrote entitled As Much Truth as One Can Bear, he said, not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it's faced. Such powerful words for our country and for you. We cannot stick our heads in the sand this time. We cannot tinker around the edges and leave the old frame intact. Your dreams on the field, on the court, wherever, must be tied to a more just world, a more just America. You and I must shake loose from the shibboleths of the past and their gods and begin again. And remember, no matter what has been done, no matter the death that shadows our steps, we cannot turn away from our responsibility. So let's begin again right where we are, LSU. Let's risk everything to finally put the sin of racism behind us and figure out how to be together differently. And that is going to require something extraordinary from you in your space, in your time. It's going to require you to risk something, LSU. Not expect someone else to do it for you, but it requires you to not tinker around the edges, but to grapple with what you have done so that you can release yourselves into a different way of being in the world. But this is going to be hard. But as Baldwin says, human beings are at once miracles and disasters. If we show up and risk ourselves in this moment, we at least have a chance for a miracle. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for those powerful remarks. I would ask anyone who wants to be part of the discussion to please include your question in the Q&A feature. I know a few of you have raised your hand, but again, if you would, please put your comments or questions in the Q&A feature. Before I start with the question, Dr. Glaude, I just wanted to make you aware of a group of student athletes at LSU who have answered the charge that you just gave. There are 6 founders of the newly established Black Student Athlete Association. And so they are hard at work trying to be the change that they want to see. And they are among the student groups that are the driving force behind trying to get African and African-American studies required. And they've been meeting with administration and trying to get things done. And it includes men and women from basketball to track and field and softball. So just want to let you know about the great work that's being done by LSU's BSAA, and very proud of what they're doing. You talk a lot about lies and truth and about myths and so forth. And I've been really interested in the concept of American civil religion, which I won't go into great detail now, but you well know many scholars, including sociologists, have all but abandoned talking about American civil religion. I think it's very important and relevant for what we're seeing today. But if you could comment a bit more on how we go about, trying to convince people that these are actual lies, and how do we go about debunking these myths that have been so much a part of American history that, some people just, no matter what kind of data or evidence you present to them, they just still hold on to those lies and to those myths.
Yeah, I mean, this is the point of the power of narratives, of counter stories, right? We have to constantly engage in the hard work of reframing. Whatever you think about the 1619 project that the New York Times and Nicole Hannah-Jones and what they were trying to do in terms of its details, I mean, we can quibble, but what are they trying to do? They're trying to kind of engage in a re-narration of the country. So what would it mean to shift from Plymouth Rock to Jamestown, to shift from 1776 to 1619? Well, if you shift to 1619, certain things come into view, right? That is, one, we were a corporation before we were a nation. That lets us know about a certain kind of economic thrust. Another, Native peoples are in the picture in a way that's very different than the way in which we talk about Thanksgiving, for example. Or, of course, enslaved people are present. Indentured servants are present, right? So 1619 brings into view something even more important: failure, right? It's a failed colony, right? And so it orients you differently. The late Edward Said said, the problem of beginnings is the beginning of the problem. Where you start matters. And so we have to engage in this ongoing battle of telling a story differently, right? Instead of saying that people in poor neighborhoods don't want to keep their neighborhoods clean, well, why don't we tell a story about how the schedule for trash pickup is very different in particular communities as opposed to others, right? We can begin to narrate a whole range of issues. Now, that doesn't mean people are going to be convinced. We just got to insist on telling a different story at every turn, and challenging the myths and legends, and particularly when they don't hold up. Because you see, in this moment, right in the moment, Dr. Martin, when we're protesting the murder of George Floyd, there is a challenge to American public memory. And people are like, I don't understand how the challenge to criminal justice and the murder of George Floyd turns into an attack on Confederate monuments, or Woodrow Wilson, or Christopher Columbus. Because in the public imagination of these protesters, there's a connection between the celebration of these figures who were critical to upholding white supremacy, and its extension in the very act of Officer Chavin with his knee on George Floyd's neck. And so there's a relationship between how we remember and how we currently act, right? And so I think we have to just simply continuously and ruthlessly re-narrate, tell the story, right? Don't allow people to protect their innocence, right? So that involves ongoing deconstruction, as it were.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I appreciate your emphasis on the significance of memory. And I can't help but notice the book behind you with Toni Morrison on the front. And I know that you, mentioned Toni Morrison in your work, and she's one of my favorite people as well. And so before I move to some of the questions from individuals on this webinar, we'd like to get your thoughts about why you think it's important for people to read folks like Toni Morrison and W.E.B. Du Bois and James Baldwin. I mean, what kind of insights do they give us for what we're dealing with today?
Oh, absolutely. It's the same reason why we would read Chekhov or Gabriel Garcia Marquez or Tolstoy, right? The same reason why we would read these figures. Why? Because they give us an angle, insight on what it means to be human. From the very moment we take our first breath, we start dying. And so the idea of what happens in between that first breath and that last breath, how Baldwin says that, we hold off the fear of death by embracing with passion the conundrum of life. That these writers give us an insight on the human journey, on the human drama, particularly in this place, that offer us a fuller understanding of what it means to be a human being on its way or on her way to the tomb. And so there's a universality in the particularity of what they're writing about. That's the first claim. And then the second claim is that it will disabuse us of the lies that the value gap requires. Will give us insight into the way in which the value gap has evidenced itself in this country, right? And offer us a release. Let me say it, put it this way, Dr. Martin. They will offer us a means to release our imaginations, right? So I don't get the jokes in Dostoevsky, or no, he doesn't have jokes. I don't get the jokes in Gogol, or, you know, the Russian writer and his book Dead Souls, because I'm not Russian. I don't know the particulars of the references, but there's something about that book that expands my horizon, right? Same thing will happen to you if you sat down with Richard Wright's Native Son, or what would happen to you if you tackled, you know, Milkman and Song of Solomon, which is one of my favorites, by the way, right? So this is, I would commend these books for anyone who's aspiring to be a fuller human being, so that they can leave behind the swaddling clothes and grow up.
Excellent, thank you. You also write a lot about rage, and this is a concept that I'm fascinated by. I recently was on another webinar with Dr. Finley and Dr. Gray from Syracuse University, and we were asked why we entitled one of our projects, you know, The Religion of White Rage, as opposed to using another word like angry and so forth. And so I appreciate you taking a deeper dive into the term rage and who, you know, is allowed to exhibit rage, and how we can understand legitimate versus illegitimate rage. Because you talk a little bit about the connection between race and rage, and how that has an impact on how we engage in direct action.
Sure, I would urge everyone to read Carol Anderson's wonderful book on white rage. It is extraordinary. She's an extraordinary historian out of Emory University. So I would say, you know, really kind of, you know, drill down right there. But for me, you know, there's this, you know, white fear is really complicated. And Black folk know that. We have stories in our families about the consequences of white fear and white rage. And so we wear the mask, as Langston Hughes would say, right? We dance, we're silent. Or as the late Stuart Scott said on ESPN, we have to be cool as the other side of the pillow, because we can't be angry. That moment when Barack Obama said that the police officer who arrested Henry Louis Gates Jr., that he was stupid, look what it generated. Or even that moment when Michelle Obama and Barack Obama bumped fists, and people were like, oh my God, was that the initiation of an underground cell? Will the radicals now come? Because there's this ongoing fear that Black people are wearing the mask, that we are really angry. So you read notes, you know, on the state of Virginia with Thomas Jefferson. He says he's fearing what God is going to do because of the sin of slavery. There are slaveholders across the country, read them in South Carolina, in Mississippi, in Louisiana, who are fearful because they know that these human beings that they say aren't human beings must reject and resist their condition of living. That deep down inside, the great scandal of Black life is that they're not really loving, that we hate white folk, that we're skeptical of their moral capacity, because we have every reason to be. And so what Baldwin is saying for me, right? And Baldwin sits in that space, the synthesis between Malcolm and Martin. Baldwin is saying the rage cannot become hatred, but the rage lights the kiln, right? Because when we suppress it, it generates all of these collateral effects in our bodies, in our social lives. We in effect dance and become complicit with the world as it is, because we're not speaking our minds, not telling the truth. Right? Being quiet, quieting and muting ourselves because we're afraid of triggering white fear. But what does it mean to really be free? What does it mean to be able to give voice to one's anger? That doesn't mean you're walking around just shouting at people. I'm not saying that. But what I'm saying is that if you are maladjusted to injustice, then sometimes it's going to take the form of righteous indignation. I was rageful after watching what happened to George Floyd. Rageful after what happened to Walter Wallace. His mama was caught begging the police not to kill him. They called 911 for an ambulance, y'all. And the police came and now they're burying their baby, right? Who was having a mental health crisis. It's funny how certain bodies magnetize bullets and other bodies don't. As videos show knife-wielding white men coming after police and they survived. Dylan Roof even survived, right? So part of the rage involves giving true expression, right, to the existential reality of one's life, of one's condition. But it has to become radical rage. It has to be constructive in its effects, not destructive. It can't turn inward. It has to evidence itself in a way of fighting for a more just world. If you try to read James Baldwin and you only emphasize love, you're gonna miss him. You're not gonna understand him. Baldwin said he had to leave the United States in 1948 because either he was gonna kill somebody or somebody was gonna kill him. And so we have to be honest with the effects, particularly in the South. We have to be honest, and maybe that'll free us into a different way of being together.
Thank you. So thinking about, being in the South, you're probably aware of some recent cases here in Louisiana where there have been some concerns about official reports about young Black men in particular and their deaths, and then concerns from the family member, the broader community about what really happened to them. And I'm speaking specifically about Kawan Bobby Charles. And so there's a question in the chat asking if you would respond to the framing of his death.
I don't know much about the particulars, so I don't want to overstep my bounds, right? But, look, the value gap as a concept, right, was, I wrote about it in order to give us a way of framing how our lives are devalued, how a kind of general disregard defines the way in which racism functions in the country. So if the value gap organizes this belief that white people matter more than others, if it organizes our social, political, and economic arrangements, it's going to evidence itself in those moments when Black life is just simply disregarded, even our babies, right? Even our babies. And so part of what we have to do in those moments is attack it at its root, right? Not just simply assert the value of Bobby Charles's life, but to assert the value of Black lives more broadly. So it becomes the occasion to challenge the underlying assumptions that shape policing. Remember, I said this, and it's an echo of James Baldwin's formulation, that policing in Black communities today is an extension of the slave codes. And what Jimmy was saying in this provocative way is that Black communities are supposed to be contained, disciplined, right? They're to know what we are, to know our place. And so when we move outside of those spaces, the violence of the state is deployed against those bodies, right? To put them in place, to contain and constrain. And so we have to figure out how to challenge this, right? In these moments when we've lost loved ones. It's hard because we have to engage in this haunting Black ritual of public grief, right? And Baton Rouge knows something about that, right? But it's in those moments that we have to call folks to the carpet. Now, let me say this about white folks, our white brothers and sisters. You have to make a choice. You have to make a choice. I happen to love a lot of people who happen to be white, and then they're white people. Understand the distinction. I happen to love a lot of people who happen to be white, and then they're white people. Those who happen to be white are those who are engaged in the ongoing interrogation of how the value gap defines our world and trying desperately, even though they understand that racism comes to them as easy as language itself. They're trying to deconstruct it in themselves, knowing they're going to fall short. But white people are those who are invested in the distribution of advantage and disadvantage along the lines of the value gap. They like the world as it is. They don't have to just simply be loud racists. They could be folk who love their schools, their segregated communities, love the way in which advantage and disadvantage is distributed across the color line in this country. So silence in the face of these injustices is complicity. It's not enough to just tell your friends, oh my God, I'm horrified by the death of Bobby Charles, or how they ignored it. And that it's not enough to do that. Silence is complicity. Use your vocal cords. We need you to help us build a new world, a new America. But anyway, that's not an answer, but it's my groping for one.
No, that was an answer. And thank you very much for that. Again, you can keep coming with the questions in the question and answer feature. We have time for a few more. I'll ask something that I was thinking about after leading a discussion about democracy in Black, and that is that you've expressed concern about the future of key social institutions in the Black community, including the Black church and historically Black colleges and universities. And I'm just curious about what you see as some of the most pressing concerns, and what are some ways that national, state, and local governments and ordinary citizens can strengthen them?
Well, COVID has made it even more difficult, right? We saw before COVID-19 an uptick in Black students enrolling in HBCUs. We were moving back to HBCUs, and I'm a proud graduate of Morehouse College. I understand the power of that institution. Everything I am is a result of my mom and my dad and Morehouse. So we saw that there were challenges, even though we were seeing upticks in enrollment. And those challenges had everything to do with resources, that the schools just couldn't keep their doors open. The landscape had shifted in certain ways. COVID-19 has revealed in some ways the hierarchy within American higher education, as research-rich institutions like Princeton and LSU, right, we're thriving in interesting sorts of ways. Princeton more so, Harvard more so than state institutions in some ways. But those other spaces downstream, those that are struggling to keep their doors open as students are choosing not to go online and the like. So the first thing we have to do is to understand the inequality that's built into American higher education and how we can address that at the public level. So we've seen over the last decade a wholesale attack on public funding of public institutions of higher education. Look at what's happened in North Carolina. Look at what's happened in Wisconsin. Look at what's happened in Texas and the like, right? I don't know much about Louisiana, but I suspect state legislatures are engaged in this ongoing belt tightening, and administrators in places like LSU have to figure out what they're going to do. And what has been driving tuition increase has been precisely the decrease in public funding. So we need to shift that pattern at the level of public institutions, at the level of places like Morehouse and Spelman and Tuskegee and Hampton and Prairie View, and I can go, and Dillard and Xavier. We're going to have to see much more responsible response among the alumni base. We're going to have to give back in a way that can support and sustain these institutions through this crisis, right? We're going to have to see, although Donald Trump touts what he's done for HBCUs, we're going to have to see a more concerted and directed effort on the part of the federal government to help fund these institutions, because no matter what LSU says, no matter what Princeton says, we know that Howard, Spelman, Morehouse, and institutions like that are producing the Black doctors. They're producing the Black engineers. They're producing the Black lawyers, right? So it involves state support, shifting how we fund. It involves federal support, a much more directed and deliberate support of HBCUs, and it involves alumni support, that we have to begin to increase how those of us who benefited from these institutions give back. That's off the top of the dome. I could say some other things, but that's just off the top of my head.
No, that's very helpful. It's a complex question, and you did a wonderful job of responding to it. Just this might take a while to respond to, but it's a very good, important question from Dr. David Stamps in mass communications, who's done some work recently on Black people's experience with COVID here in Baton Rouge. And I'll just read his comment. He says, there was a percentage, small but real, that supported a racist, bigoted president, arguably demonstrating anti-Blackness and embracing some idea of individualism and merit. Can you share your thoughts on Black folks who went to vote and voted for 45?
Yeah, you know, I mean, I can't wait to be able to drill down into the data a bit more to see the nature of that percent, you know, what that percentage was, right? So, you know, exit poll data in this particular election is, to my mind, is notoriously unhelpful because of the large mail-in vote. But I think it's a wonderful, wonderful question to grapple with. First of all, we need to just state some basic things, that Black folk aren't monolithic, that there are conservative Black folk, that they're, you know, that just because we're Black, there's no necessary relationship between the color of our skin and progressive politics. So let's just be clear about that. In fact, among Black Christians, if you control for race, according to a Pew study a while back, if you control for race, we're as conservative as Mormons, right? When you think about it. So I want to just acknowledge that there's ideological differentiation within Black communities. We're not just a monolith, although we tend to vote like one sometimes. So that accounts for certain things. I think there's also hypermasculinity, a kind of toxic masculinity that evidenced itself, right? That Donald Trump represented a certain kind of manliness for some Black male voters in particular. And I liken it to, you know, folks who know WE wrestling is fake, but they continue to go and watch it and love it, and they have their fans and da-da-da-da. So I think there's some folks who are conservative, some folks who like the theater and spectacle of Trumpism, and they double down on it. But the thing that I'm really interested in, and this is the last point that I think is really important, is that white supremacy is not the only thing that is jeopardizing our polity. It's not the only thing that threatens the republic. Selfishness and greed threaten the republic. And selfishness and greed aren't the sole possessions of white folk. There are folk who are voting for Donald Trump because their 401ks are better. Folks that voted for Donald Trump because they support the tax cut that disproportionately benefited them. Folks who are voting for Donald Trump who think that big government, right, pose a threat to their own individual liberty. Again, a synonym for selfishness. So I want to say that selfishness evidenced itself across demographics, right? That's my intuition. And we need to begin to drill down in that regard. We're seeing an uptick among those numbers because we've seen an uptick generally. More people voted in this election than any other election in the history of the country. So we're going to see numbers increase. And I'm not even a numbers guy, Dr. Martin. We're going to see those numbers increase across the board because more people showed up, right, to vote. I mean, Biden is closing in on 80 million votes. I mean, that's mind-blowing given the nature of our elections. So and of course, Donald Trump comes in second in terms of the most votes received. So we're going to see the increase in numbers in these areas of folks supporting folk like Donald Trump. And I think the way in which we might account for it is that ideological differentiation, a kind of toxic masculinity among Black men, and of course, the most important for me is selfishness is not the possession simply of white American voters.
Thank you. So I'll just ask one final question. Again, I mentioned that this event was co-sponsored by African American Studies. And before we started the webinar, I talked about some of the great things that are happening at LSU with African American Studies. And just wanted to get your thoughts on what you think the future of African and African American Studies is, you know, for reshaping American democracy, especially as is experienced by Black people.
I think it's one of our tasks is to not only kind of continue to expand the archive, that is the archive that the nation can draw on, offering resources to tell the story differently, right? To give different points of entry, different angles to understand this fragile experiment in democracy. African American studies cannot be thought of, and this is really important, as a place where Black folk go to feel good about themselves, or white students or students who are non-Black go to affirm their progressive commitments. That's not what the field is about. It is a particular point of entry to the extraordinary human drama, right? It offers us insight, as I said earlier, into why we should read these folk, into the complexity of human doings and sufferings, particularly in this place called the United States. So African American Studies has to be seen as an essential part of what it means to produce a cosmopolitan student. Someone who can walk into this world and be able to read race, to understand how it's workings, to be able to deal with difference, to be able to navigate a world that is diverse, that is multicultural, that is complex in its history and in its present doing. So I'm just so excited about what y'all are doing at LSU. I want you to really understand that the South is the source of, it is the answer to the riddle of the Sphinx. So you are in the middle of it. Draw on all that you have to understand that region, because once we get this place, once we get home right, the nation will be right.
Dr. Glaude, I can't thank you enough for joining us here today. Again, on behalf of African American Studies and the LSU Athletics Department, we are really grateful for you taking time out of your schedule to share your wisdom and expertise, and to and for your assistance in continuing to motivate and inspire us to be the change that we want to see. And again, personally, I thank you for making me think, and for making me want to dig deeper into the areas that are of interest to me. And I'm sure that everyone on this call is forever indebted to you for your presence with us today. In the last 2 minutes, I'll just give you an opportunity to make any closing comments that you'd like, and then wish everyone well.
I want to speak directly to the athletes and what they're doing. They're, you know, first of all, I'm in awe of you. Leverage your power. You can change the world. And I want to say something that we must all remember, and I remember this, I keep it in the front of my mind as a country boy from Moss Point, Mississippi, that the world conspires to make you small. And the question is whether you're going to be complicit. Dream big dreams and step in them boldly with your back straight, right? Because the world is waiting for us. All right, appreciate you.
Thank you so much. Those are powerful words for our student athletes and for all of us on this call. Be well. Thank you so much.
Take care, everybody. Stay safe.
You too.